Thank you very much, Paul. Paul and I go back a long way, working at NBC in Washington together. I was a county boy, and he is an announcer. And we've just been sharing stories the past few days of the really golden days of broadcast journalism in America, where all of these folks came out of print or wire service, and they were real journalists. They cared about what we then called a craft. And now it has become something else, in my view, and in the view of many other people. But it's a great pleasure to be back at Chautauqua. I was here almost 40 years ago, and so I'm looking forward to my next appearance in 2061. This is a beautiful place, I don't have to tell you that, and people are just wonderful here, and I'm very grateful to be returning. My wife is here and back somewhere. Hope you'll get to meet her, and I'd be happy to sign my books. I want to talk a little bit today about an item in the news, just to start with, because sometimes news items tell a greater story and make a greater point than any pundit or commentator. So I give you this story from Oakland, California, for you to draw your own conclusions. Oakland Police Chief LeRon Armstrong warned that the funding cuts in the police department will force the department to cut 50 officers and 2 new police academy classes, even as 5 officers leave the department every month. Astonishingly, I love this word, astonishingly, just hours after Armstrong's warning, armed robbers held up a news crew interviewing Oakland's head of violence prevention outside City Hall. I rest my case. On January 5th, July 5th, excuse me, 1926, Calvin Coolidge, President of the United States, and my great uncle by marriage, spoke on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Coolidge, you may know, if you read the right history books, was a man of few words. But when he spoke, he had something to say. 2 of my favorite stories about Coolidge. One night during a reception at the White House, a woman came through the receiving line and said, "Mr. President, I have a bet with a friend of mine that I can get you to say more than 2 words. Coolidge responded, "You lose." The other story, and these are true, and some are apocryphal, but I checked these out, these are true. One Sunday morning, Grace Coolidge, the First Lady, was not feeling well, and so Calvin went off to church by himself. And when he came home, Mrs. Coolidge said, "Calvin, what did the preacher preach on today?" And Coolidge responded, "He preached on sin." "Well, what did he say about it?" "He was against it." There you are. On that august occasion in 1926, Coolidge delivered a terrific speech. I think the best I've ever read on the Declaration of Independence. And I just share this little excerpt with you today because I think it is profound and something we need to remember and pass on to future generations. He said, "A spring will cease to flow if its source be dried up. A tree will wither if its roots be destroyed." In its main features, the Declaration of Independence is a great spiritual document. It is a declaration not of material, but of spiritual conceptions: equality, liberty, popular sovereignty, the rights of man. These are not elements which we can see and touch. They are ideals. They have their source and their roots in the religious convictions. They belong to the unseen world. Unless the faith of the American people in these religious convictions is to endure, the principles of our Declaration will perish. Listen, we cannot continue to enjoy the result if we neglect and abandon the cause. We cannot continue to enjoy the result if we neglect and abandon the cause. Now, for many years, I've covered Washington and government programs and proposals, and I've seen the politicians come and go. Some should have gone sooner, others should have not come in the first place. The problem, the frustrating thing for so many Americans is that we are spending more than we've ever spent before and getting less. We are, when I was growing up, we subsidized and encouraged the things we wanted more of, and penalized and discouraged the things we wanted less of. But today it seems to me that we are doing the opposite. We are subsidizing and encouraging the things we say we want less of, and penalize and discouraging the things we say we want more of, and are shocked to find we're getting more of what we want less of and less of what we want more of. Notice, not a note. That was pretty good. No progress on my glasses. The other thing is we have moved from an era in which hard work, personal responsibility, and accountability were the rule into its opposite, envy, greed, and entitlement. As a young reporter, I interviewed a lot of wealthy and successful people. I didn't envy them. I asked them, where did you go to school? What did you study? What's your philosophy of life? I want to be like you someday. But today, if you make $1 and I make only 50 cents, you owe me 50 cents to make it fair. That's socialism. That's stealing from the productive. And today we have the unholy trinity of envy, greed, and entitlement. And you see it everywhere, even in your commercials. I've just been watching in the hotel room, Joe Namath, and this Medicare supplement thing that he advertises. He must say the word entitlement at least 4 times during the ad, and benefit at least 6, and free another 6, including the toll-free number. When did it occur in this country that we were entitled to other people's money? The notion by our friends on the secular progressive side is that there is a fixed amount of wealth in this country. And if you are making a lot of it, you are robbing somebody else. I never felt that way. I never envied anybody who was making more than I do, and there are plenty of people who make more than I do. I wrote a column a couple of years ago when this business about wealth disparity was being promoted in the media. And I said I had a deep, dark secret that I had kept hidden for years that I felt it was necessary to now confess. I suffer from income inequality. Yes, the shame. It's true. There are always people making more than me. But you know, I don't care, because wealth is not a fixed amount. There's plenty to go around. But the politicians promote the opposite because it fuels their power and place. My favorite story about this involves my good friend, and he was my good friend, George McGovern, the 1972 presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, senator from South Dakota. We would go out and have civil debates on the lecture circuit. And I remember after one, it happened to be in Indiana, a man came up to me afterwards and said, my wife and I'd like to take you out for a bite to eat. I said, well, thank you, Senator McGovern, though, and I have already decided we're going to have dinner together. He looks at me and says, how can you eat with a man like that? I said, easy, he's a friend of mine. I never let politics divide, but I notice a lot of other people do. Anyway, when George lost in the Reagan landslide in 1980, he other than public service since coming back from World War II, where he actually served. And so he decided to do something completely different. He went up to Connecticut and wanted in and tried to run it. And after less than 2 years, it went bankrupt. And the Wall Street Journal called him up, wanted to know what happened. And then the only thing you need to know of what happens to politicians who stay too long in Washington, George McGovern said this, gee, if I'd known how difficult it was to run a business, I might have voted differently in the Senate. What else do you need to know? Patrick Leahy, who I also know a little bit, senator from Vermont, was bragging a year or two ago when he said in front of the cameras, I've been in the Senate 40 years. That's the problem, Senator. You see, when the founders established America, they intended for people to come to Washington and serve for limited times. They didn't need a term limits law. There was no idea of perpetuating politics as a career. These were lawyers, business people, academics, whatever. They would come and serve their country for a limited time and then go home to their real jobs. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, broke the mold, running and winning 4 terms, and it's been off to the races ever since. This is why we need term limits. We need to recycle trash and Congress for the same reason, because each left in one place too long begins to emit a foul odor. The great frustration for me and a lot of other people is, to quote from a previous book of mine, The Way to a Higher Authority, we know what works. We may not know a cure for cancer right now, but we know a cure for a lot of other things. We are approaching a record debt. In fact, we already have a record debt. We are approaching a debt of $30 trillion. And as I write in my latest book, America's Expiration Date, national debt has been one of the common denominators of every failed great nation and empire throughout history. The other two, or 3 really, are uncontrolled immigration without assimilation. We want people to come to America, but we want them legally and orderly, and we want them to bring something to contribute, not just to come and take. So uncontrolled immigration without assimilation. And then the third thing that is the common denominator of the collapse of great nations and superpowers of the past is a loss of a shared moral sense and a lack of belief in God, which goes together. What we are seeing today, it would have been shocking, to my parents and grandparents. Or as Cole Porter put it in a wonderful satirical song years ago, in olden days, a glimpse of stocking was looked on as something shocking. Now heaven knows anything goes. Good authors who once knew better words now only use 4-letter words writing prose. Anything goes. The world is going mad today, and day's night today, and black's white today. And those guys today, the women prize today, are just silly gigolos. But he meant it as a satire today to be an editorial. How does this happen to a country and a culture? It's not about hating people who are different from me. It is about establishing a standard. Try this at the grocery store. Well, I think this is a pound of potatoes. Well, the grocer said, no, it's 2 pounds. Yeah, but I have my truth, you have your truth. And if my truth makes me feel good and your truth makes you feel good, that's all that matters, even though they may be contradictory. How did we get to that point? We got to that point because we have forgotten the standards that created and sustained this country from its founding. Have we had problems? Of course we have. But to suggest, for example, as the critical race theory people are suggesting now, that somehow slavery is the mark of Cain or the scarlet letter that can never, ever be removed is saying something that just isn't true. We have spent more money fighting poverty, trying to establish equality, overcoming discrimination, and still doing so in housing, in voting. I read a piece a few weeks ago about, my Democratic friends talk a lot about Jim Crow laws. Who was it that passed the Jim Crow laws? It was the Democrats, Southern Democrats. Who was it that tried to keep African Americans from voting by these quizzes that they gave when they showed up at the polls? But those were Democrats. Who is it that still has a building named after him in Washington, the Senate office building, who was against the Voting Rights Act, who was against the Open Housing Act? Who was it? Richard B. Russell, who told Lyndon Johnson that if he pushed for this sort of thing, the Democratic Party would be finished in the South. And it was for a while, but that wasn't the issue. And Johnson did the right thing. So we are constantly overcoming the sins of the past. But what we need, in my view, is something that my great governor now, I moved to Florida 2 years ago to marry my wonderful wife. She seduced me out of it. And I'm enjoying every day of it. We were high school classmates. That's a wonderful story. It'll be on Hallmark Channel before long. So here's what Ron DeSantis, who many think will be a presidential candidate in the next election, recently did. He signed 3 bills to strengthen civics education in Florida. Now, just stop and think about that for a moment. To strengthen civics education. I mean, civics, when I was in high school, was a normal thing. You study the Constitution, how a bill becomes law. You'd read, we had to memorize the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence, all these other things. All of that was thought necessary as part of a fundamental education. I remember something Nathan Pusey said when he was president of Harvard, which makes another great point. He said, the least that should be expected of a Harvard graduate is that he learned to pronounce the name of God without embarrassment. I spoke at the 350th anniversary of Harvard, and I said it appeared to me that God had become the embarrassment of Harvard. The sad reality is that only 2 in 5 Americans, DeSantis said, 2 in 5 Americans can correctly name the 3 branches of government. Now that's pretty shocking. And more than a third of Americans cannot name any of the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. As a matter of fact, if you look at some of the polls of the past, there are a lot of young people who would deprive people of some of their First Amendment rights if they speak about things that these young people don't agree with. I remember my late friend, Matt Hentoff, who was a great First Amendment guy, great jazz aficionado, said the answer to speech you don't like is not less speech, it's more speech. I could not agree more. I've had people write newspapers demanding that I be canceled. These, of course, are people who are tolerant, pluralistic, pro-diversity, in favor of academic freedom, and all of those other buzzwords we hear from people who don't really mean it. And so DeSantis concluded, it is abundantly clear that we need to do a much better job of educating our students in civics to prepare them for the rest of their lives. And I said, yes, in recent decades, we've learned the hard way what happens to a country that forgets the basics of its own greatness. If American history is forgotten, along with the lessons of civics and the Constitution, then it's no surprise that young people schooled instead in pop culture and nihilism will fall prey to Antifa-ish ideologues. So we must most definitely need a plan for teaching people more than just the fakeries of the Marvel Comics universe and Black Lives Matter. Americans need to know, for example, that the U.S. Constitution is not just some musty old document written by white supremacists, but rather a practical and enduring guide to small R Republican self-governance. Of DeSantis' 3 bills aimed at fixing this civics gap problem, the first concerns the teaching of civics in grades K-12. The second concerns teaching civics in state colleges and universities. And the third, the most controversial, requires those state schools to, quote, conduct annual assessments of viewpoint diversity and intellectual freedom. I love that part. Now, we might pause to admire the thoroughness of DeSantis' approach. As we have learned, it's not good enough for Republicans to simply write a law saying that some good thing, such as civics education, is supposed to happen. Why not? Because if the bureaucrats think they can get away with it, they will find ways of maneuvering around or simply ignoring any such law. So what's needed is constant monitoring of law abidingness, or as the bill has it, annual assessments. And we're not talking about condo fees here. As they say, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Furthermore, we can also admire the way that DeSantis has captured and inverted the notion of diversity. As we know, to the left, diversity is defined as merely skin color or gender. And yet, DeSantis is saying that we should most prize diversity of thought. And so now, all of a sudden, the usual suspect champions of lefty diversity are outraged. For instance, the Miami Herald published an angry editorial accusing DeSantis of, quote, targeting academia, certainly true, and of being anti-democratic, certainly not true. Yet, interestingly, even the Herald conceded, quote, there's no denying that many universities have traditionally been hotbeds of liberalism. Who knew? And the newspaper further conceded, it's also likely that in any environment where one point of view is predominant, those who think differently might feel shunned, as conservatives say they are on college campuses. In other words, even seen through the liberal eyes of this establishment media outlet, there's a logic to what DeSantis is doing. These are, after all, state-supported schools. There's these are state-supported schools. So yes, the interests of the people of Florida, who elected not only DeSantis, but also the Republican state legislature, should be fairly represented. To put that another way, the taxpayers who foot the bill for public schools ought not to be insulted by the schooling. So, how do we fix some of this? This is the question I most often get. I have two suggestions that, if implemented, I believe will work. Number one, we have to get our children, or in the case of what appears to be the age of us here in this room, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, out of the government re-education camps. And by that I mean the public schools and the universities. It was Barbara Bush who said some years ago, men and women, if you have children, they must come first. Our success as a nation, your success as a family, depends less on what happens in the White House and more what happens in your house. So that's number one. Why would we don't send our troops to Iran or to China or to Russia to be trained, but why would we send our young people into schools and universities that teach the opposite of what we believe? It makes absolutely no sense. I've heard all the excuses. Well, they don't have football in the private school, and the homeschool, they can't do anything. Well, you're responsible not for the outcome of your child's education and intellectual development, but you are responsible for what you put in. The number two solution, and this I think would work better than anything else, which is why the politicians won't do it. Every agency of government, every program has a charter or a piece of legislation establishing its existence and defining its purpose. If that agency of government or program is working according to its charter or legislative goal, and if it cannot be done better by the private sector and for less expense, we keep it, whether it's a liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat program. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? We certainly do that in business. If a sales plan is working, we keep it. If it's not working, we get rid of it. And probably the employee who came up with the bonehead idea in the first place. So, and the second part is that every head of agency of every government should be required to come before Congress every, say, 2 years and justify their very existence. The problem is, as Reagan said, the only proof of eternal life in Washington is a government program. It's easier to kill a vampire. And the analogy is good because so many of these are blood-sucking. And by the way, you know the difference in definition of politics. I mean, holly means many, and ticks are blood-sucking insects. You can't, if you try to cut the rate of increase in spending, not cut the spending, if you try to cut the rate of increase in spending, you get editorials from the Washington Post, the New York Times, two papers I read every day along with my Bible, so each side is doing. The sneezer interrupted my laugh line. That's all right. And they denounce you as uncaring about the poor, a racist, a bigot, a sexist, a homophobe, whatever. I like what Jack Kemp used to say, the late congressman and HUD secretary. He said, we who are conservatives don't measure compassion by how many people are receiving government assistance. We measure compassion by how many people we get off government assistance. And this is the last thing some politicians want. They don't want people to be independent of government because it robs them of their power and their fundraising ability. I was just asked a few minutes ago out in the other room, why don't you ever have common ground? Because you can't raise money. I asked a fundraiser once years ago in my naivete, how come you never send out a positive letter, fundraising letter on what you're doing with people's donations? And he said, you can't raise money on positive. So you watch your average cable TV show, and you got somebody on the left and the right, and they're yelling at each other and disagreeing. And what is the result? Nothing. There's no solutions offered. And the fundraising letters. Oh, send me $25 or so-and-so is going to molest your daughter. And then the other side says, send me $25 or that guy's going to molest your daughter. And the checks get cashed, and some of these guys, some of these fundraisers raise money from both sides of the street. They're like cheap bookers. They don't care. The checks get cashed and they laugh all the way to the bar. It's cynical. It's diabolical. Most of us know what works. Most of us know solutions that will promote the general welfare, provide for the common defense, and ensure domestic tranquility. So how come we don't get it done? Because we don't vote for the right people, and we don't keep after them once they're in office. And we don't talk to our neighbors and our friends. Most people vote on feelings and perceptions, and not on real solid ideological and principled grounds. If we want to maintain this country, not just for ourselves, but for succeeding generations, we have to renew, like a library book, the values and virtues passed down to us by our parents and grandparents. Otherwise, they will expire. The purpose of my book, the foundation of it, was based on an essay by the late British diplomat Sir John Glubb, who studied 4,000 years of human history and found that the average age of empires and great nations is only 250 years. Now, some lasted longer than others, like Rome, for example. Byzantium had several iterations, incarnations. But the average was 250 years, and even Rome, and even some that lasted a little longer, like Rome, still followed the same pattern to self-destruction. It was Lincoln who said that America doesn't have to fear as much, I'm paraphrasing, from an invading army as it does from crumbling from within. And of course, the Civil War was our greatest challenge, wasn't it? So if we want this experiment called America to work, if we want it to be around not just for another 5 years when it's 250 years old, but for generations yet to come, we have to work at it. Democracy, a constitutional republic, is not the natural state of humanity. If it were, there would be more of them around the world. Religious fundamentalism, dictatorship, censorship of the press, intolerance, jailing just because you disagree with the government, those are the norms in the world today. We are an oasis in a desert of all of these other horrible things. And we have a lot of enemies. We have China, we have Iran, we have Russia. But the greatest enemy we have, if we don't see to it, is ourselves. If we take for granted what has been handed to us by the greatest generation, if we take these things for granted, we will not survive. There is no guarantee. You cannot return to sender. You can't go back to the manufacturer and ask for a new deal. So that's what I'm challenging you to do today. Not because of me, but because of history, which pretty much will now be called herstory, I guess, or history. All hymnals are being changed to hymnals. You got to push back. And whatever you think of Donald Trump, and a lot of people have opinions about him, and I certainly do, and I didn't like his personality and the way he demeans other people, but he pushes back. And that's why he is under such attack, because the establishment realizes that he has their number. And so does 74 million people, or 75 million, who voted for him in the last election. I'm not endorsing anybody. I'm just saying this is what happens when you push back, and not just in politics. It's what happens when you push back here. It's what happens when you push back in academia. It's what happens in any area. People want to go with the flow. The problem with going with the flow is it runs over the falls sometimes, and you get killed. So don't worry about enemies you might make. Don't worry about being liked. Stand for what you know is objective truth. I get a lot of hate mail, or I used to. Some of it was in crayon. Some of the early ones I sent to my editor and said, see, I told you I'd bring a different group of people to the discussion. But it doesn't bother me. I laugh at it. You know, when I was doing commentary on NPR, the only conservative there for some while, my favorite piece of hate mail came from a guy who wrote and said, is there some kind of inbreeding program at NPR that produces a guy like Thomas? I like that. That was creative. Just calling me a name, that doesn't count. It goes in the trash, but really creative. And think of the great insults of the past. You know, Winston Churchill was sitting at dinner one night next to a woman who turned to him and said, "Winston, you're drunk." And Churchill responded, "Madam, you're ugly. In the morning, I shall be sober." That's not an insult. I like that. Being more creative like that. So, anyway, just some thoughts thrown out for your consideration. And if there's anybody with, any questions, such as, you often get mistaken for George Clooney, I'll be happy to answer them about blind people. So thanks very much for your kind attention.